Hi guys, and welcome to my showcase and tutorial for Cooking 2.0. This plugin extends the vanilla cooking system in Rust by adding a number of ingredients and recipes to the game. The ingredients are obtained from 30 plus sources and includes chopping trees, mining nodes, and harvesting different varieties of plants such as hemp, potatoes, pumpkins, corns, etc. These ingredients can be used to create delicious meals for your players to eat and provide them with some pretty unique buffs. This version of cooking has had its recipes and ingredients simplified, so for those of you who are familiar with the cooking from previous versions, the ingredients and the recipes have been simplified significantly and cut down, sort of to allow for ease of use in gameplay, but they still have the power and the depth to allow server owners to create more, more involved meals should the server require it. So it has a lot of configuration in here. So there are a number of ways you can gather ingredients with the cooking plugin. The primary methods are by gathering or collecting things like corn, pumpkin, potatoes, and hemp, or cutting trees, mining nodes, killing animals and skinning them, etc. etc. There's 30 different methods currently of obtaining different ingredients, so you can really be quite creative with your custom ingredients or by setting different ingredients to drop from different sources. And some of these include biome-specific ingredients as well, if you want to go into that depth. But by default, there's only one item that requires that, which is the pineapple from the desert trees. But to gather an ingredient, all you need to do is interact with or collect a hemp or something like that. You can see 3 spices were stored in my ingredient bag, and different items will give different ingredients, but they can also have crossover. So, for example, the potato will give me sugar. But it will also give me flour, whereas the corn will give me rice and potentially other stuff if I roll well enough. Yep, there we go. Also some flour. Whereas the pumpkin will give me tomatoes and rice. So there's a bit of crossover there, so you get different varieties of ingredients. You can see here that none of them are actually going into my inventory because they're all being stored directly in my ingredient bag. Now there's a couple of ways this happens. The first way is if you give the player the chat command permissions from cooking, which allows them to open up the iBag using the chat command iBag or the button. And you can see here I've got all my ingredients in here. Now this will only allow for ingredients that are used in the plugin to be put in. So for example, if I try to put my rock on my torch or any of my seeds, it's going to return them to my inventory. Whereas adding things like pumpkins and corn and everything else, it's going to allow them. Now one other thing with the ingredient bag is when you add items to it, it will actually, when you close it, would automatically stack the items into a into a larger stack group. So you can see here I've got my pumpkins, I've got my corn, and they're all stacking past the default stack sizes. And that's, yeah, I mean that's by design. So yeah, that's how that's kind of managed in the iBag. Alright, moving on to what the ingredients are used for. So we're going to look at how the recipe menu works. There's a couple of ways to bring this up. The first way is by interacting with an oven of some sort, or by using the command, which is /cook, or you can click the button down here to open it up. Now bear in mind, if your players don't have the chat command, they won't be able to use the button down here or the chat command obviously, and they'll be bound to this oven while the recipe menu is open. If you move away from it and it closes the recipe menu, whereas if you do it with a cook command, it has no effect. The oven is irrelevant. So keep that in mind. But with this menu, there's a couple of different things we should see here. We've got the recipe menu, the ingredient menu, the favorites menu, and the settings menu. So I'll take you step by step what each menu does. So one of the big changes from the previous versions, for those who are aware, is you can now see what the buff actually does, or what kind of buff the meal gives you, and whether you have the ingredients to create it or not, without actually having to go into the menu itself. You'll also notice there's some sound effects when interacting with certain elements of the menu, just to give feedback on the menu, which doesn't seem too common in UI. Now if I go into one of the recipes here, so we'll look at ice cream, I'll bring up a submenu which will show you all of the ingredients required to cook this ice cream, as well as their source. So milk, we can get it from skinning bears, boars, deer and wolves. Sugar is harvested from potatoes, and egg is harvested from skinning chickens. In this version we can also set the quantity as well, so if we want to change the quantity to 3, we can do so by adjusting the quantity value. It will also change the total requirements to match. So if I was to put that to a higher value, you can see here we no longer meet the requirements to craft these. Furthermore, we also have the flavor description of the item, which can be adjusted in the language file. We also have the buffs associated with this particular meal. So if you were to add multiple buffs into the meal, which you can, they would all be itemized and displayed down here. This also supports the use of custom permissions, so custom commands. So if you wanted to fire off a command such as adding a player to a group or giving a player a temporary permission, you can do so by adding a custom permission to the meal as well. And there's also a field to have another command fire when the meal ends, which is useful for removing those permissions, therefore making them temporary. And we can also see how long the buff lasts for and the time it takes to cook the meal. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly adjust my permissions, and then we can cook a few of these meals, and I'll show you how that works. Okay, so I'm going to go back into the ice cream menu here, and I'm going to click craft. Now when I click craft, we're going to have a cooking menu appear at the top right corner here. Now if I want to cancel this for whatever reason, I can do so by clicking on the icon, and it'll refund the ingredients to my inventory. I'm going to do it again. It's pulling the inventory. It pulls the ingredients from the eye bag first off. As you notice, I didn't have any ingredients in there beforehand. But I'm also going to queue up another meal. So I've got a bit of a hankering for some mozzarella sticks. So I'm going to add 2 mozzarella sticks to my crafting queue. You can see here that we've got one that's currently actively crafting, and we've got another one here which is being queued up. So we can see we've got 2 in the queue now. Now if I attempt to make the third one, it's going to tell me I can't because I don't have the ingredients. Let's add some bread to that mix as well. And we're going to add some more mozzarella sticks. There we go. Alright, now while that's crafting, I'll show you how the favorites menu works. So on each of the menus here, you can see you've got little star icons, and this is just simply allowing you to add favorites into the favorites menu for quick access. So if I really am a big fan of cheese sticks, I can add the favorite there, which will basically change it to a star icon, and I can now see that in my favorites menu. I can also remove it from favorites, and it's no longer there. You can do that from the recipe menu here directly. You can see I've got ice cream in there now. If I remove it, it's no longer there. Super simple. Outside of that, the favorites is really just simply a quick find method, but you can add as many items as you want to the favorites menu. So it will actually supports multiple pages. You can see here I can flick between different pages on the menu there. Now all those meals are done. You can see here I've got 3 mozzarella sticks, 2 ice cream in my inventory. I've made some bread as well, which is an ingredient used for other things. Now, if I want to inspect what these meals do, so if I've acquired these from someone else, or I made them but kind of forgot what they do, rather than having to find an oven or clicking on the cooking menu, I can click the meals button, and this will actually show me what each of these meals in my inventory do. So it's a really quick way for players to be able to see, what the purpose of each of these meals are, and this will also show any of the permission buffs that you add on there as well. So really useful. As for the ingredients menu, we've got just simply a list of ingredients and where things are gathered from. So you can see here chopping palm trees, which is basically arid trees. We've got harvesting pumpkins. We've got things like cloth, which is just simply a default rust ingredient. And in terms of ingredient bags, players can actually build their own ingredient bags using cloth if they don't have the chat command permissions, and that will allow them to open up the bag without a command. So I'll just craft that and I'll handle the permissions real quick. So if I look at my permissions here, I've got bag CMD, so I'm just going to, I believe that's through my admin groups. Go back to cooking, bag CMD, cool. So you can see here I removed the permission and I no longer have access to the button now. But what I can do is I can click open bag, and it should open the bag up rather than having to use a command. So that's how that bag works. Now if I throw it on the ground, I obviously don't have access to a bag, the actual loot itself is stored against the player's data, not within the item itself. So if they throw this away, this is just simply an access point. It doesn't store the ingredients in there specifically. So that's how the recipe menu works. There is one more element I will show you, which is the settings menu. So under settings menu, we have the ability to toggle drops on and off. So if some players don't want to participate in the cooking plugin and don't want to see drop notifications or whatnot, they can toggle this off so they no longer receive drops. We also have notifications for buff triggers. So if they consume a meal and that meal has a buff such as crafting refunds or scrap refunds or anything like that, and they'll normally kick up a chat message indicating that the buff has successfully triggered. If the players don't want to see that, they can disable that as well. We also have the cookie menu sounds, which when toggled off, prevents the menu from making any sounds. Obviously, you can have that on as well. And then this one here actually lets you reposition certain UI elements, such as the cooking queue. So if we want to reposition that, we can do so. And that'll basically position itself moving forward. We also have the one for the oven button, which we can use to reposition if we want to, depending on your server's requirements. And then we have one for the buff icons. So this is where the buffs actually display for the player. So that's another cool new feature in this plugin as well. Okay, so eating a meal will provide the player with buffs, as we discussed. Now, there is a default limit for the amount of meals a player can have concurrently running, or active meal buffs that a player can have concurrently running, and that's 3. That is completely configurable though, so if the server would like to have no limit or a ridiculously high or low limit, they can adjust that by the configuration. So I've just created a couple of meals here that you can see. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different variations there. And by default, I can only have 3 active buffs going at a time, so I'm going to eat a meal and I'll show you what happens. So first, a couple of things you'll notice. First thing is on the right hand side, you'll see my a little countdown timer indicating how long I have left on my buff, and you'll see what the buff actually gave me in the chat box here. So delicious brownie, and I have melee resistance for 70%. Now if I ate some ice cream, you'll see here the same thing applies. I ate the delicious ice cream, I now have cold resistance. Forgive me for my voice as well, I'm not getting over something. And then finally I'm going to eat some cheese toasty. You can see here I have now got provide an aura of comfort to others, for those around me. Now if I was to try and eat a sausage roll, you'll see here that it's just simply saying I'm too full to eat. But if I try to eat bread, I believe bread I can eat because it's an ingredient. It doesn't really give me any buff though. You can see here when this brownie disappears, I can now eat the next buff. Now if I was to consume a buff, for example, my ice cream is about to run out. If I was to consume a new ice cream buff, it simply refreshes the ice cream's countdown and it continues on. Some buffs will have cooldowns though, so you won't be able to experience you won't be able to stack the buffs like that. So if it does have a cooldown, the player won't be able to consume that buff again until the cooldown finishes. One feature I actually did almost forget to mention that's been put into Cooking 2.0 is the use of recipe cards. So by default we can actually make it so players can't cook any recipes and they need to find them, and this is in the form of an item called a recipe card. So I'm going to spawn a crate here because this is how you find them. So you can find them in crates, barrels, there's a multitude of different sources you can get them from, but yeah, mainly variations of crates and barrels. And when you loot it, you'll see a little chat icon, so a chat message saying you found a recipe for fried chicken, and you'll see a recipe card. So if I grab this recipe card out and I unwrap it, you learnt a new recipe, fried chicken. If I open up the recipe menu and click on recipes, you can see we now have fried chicken and we can now craft it. So really, really simple. I've decided to up the spawn rate just for demonstration purposes. It's not usually this common. We actually just got fried chicken again, but because we already have it, we already know it, so we can't learn it. So we're going to grab another one. Oh, he's got burrito. So we're going to unwrap burrito. Sausage roll. So we can now make a few recipes. So that kind of extends the grunt a little bit and gives players the ability to learn and unlock, you know, more powerful recipes and make them for others before, you know, in certain situations like RP or PvE servers. So yeah, I thought it was a really cool idea and really wanted to implement it for this release. So yeah, hope you guys enjoy that one. I'll explain a bit more about the configuration side of it in the config section. Okay, so we're going to go through the configuration settings of cooking. It's broken up into 4 different sections: general, meal settings, menu settings, and ingredient settings. So under general settings, we've got the first line here is just the commands to open up the plugin. They'll open up the recipe menu. This is if the player has the chat command by default, and they'll be able to use the recipe menu or cook in order to open it up. Should cooking handle item splitting for ingredients and meals, set to false if using a stacks plugin. I'd actually recommend leaving that as true even if you are using a stack plugin, unless you're explicitly getting an exception error. So if you're getting an error such as, you know, conflict exists between cooking and stack modifier, then set that to false and that should resolve your issue. Permission settings, specifically for drop chance multiplier permissions. Now this one here overrides the default drop chance for players that have these permissions. You can see here 1.0 represents a double in chance. So for instance, we had a hemp bush, which is a 10% chance of obtaining an ingredient when collecting a hemp, when being collected. If we have the VIP permission with this particular modifier assigned to it, we would instead have a 20% chance. If we wanted to add another one, we could do the same thing and say VIP 2 or VIP 1, which would give us a 30% chance. So that's kind of how that works. You can also go into negative values as well if you wanted to. If you have a reason to, and that would just simply give us 60% of what the default chance is. Buff settings. Now I'm going to fly through these ones here because a lot of them are very similar. Now we've got the wealth buff here, which is simply the type of currency that the player is going to receive from the wealth buff each time they break a barrel. First one is scrap, economics, or server rewards are all supported, and just simply put them in there, and it is case sensitive. Now when you see minimum, maximum quantity or min-max, it generally means it'll roll a random value between these two values. If you want the value to always be the same, just simply have the same value for min and max and it'll keep it. Component luck, electronics luck, pretty much the same as the minimum maximum values, as well as a blacklist of components or electronics that won't drop. Duplicator buff allows you to add items that won't duplicate or won't proc for the duplicator buff. So another blacklist. The pickup buff allows you to set a distance cutoff to prevent players from sniping barrels from across the map, and will only allow for melee attacks if you set that to true as well. So fishing luck is just simply quality per drop, so maximum quantity and minimum quantity per drop. Blacklists for what players can't obtain from the fishing luck buff and that sort of thing. So comfort buff is simply the radius and the amount of comfort the players receive from being close to the person with the comfort buff. And same for the shoot shed buff and everything else. It's just more around distances for work and whatnot. Settings for regens. This one here will prevent. So when a player takes damage, by default they will stop regenning, and this is how long it takes for them to start regenning. And settings for the madness buff. This is just basically the buff that plays a prefab over and over again to players nearby. By default, it's the bear trap scream. This is simply a cutoff for how far away a player can be to not hear it. Chance modifier for ingredient drops when collecting player-grown entities. Now this is just simply a global value, so if a player collects a hemp out in the wild, by default it's 10%. If we have a 0.5 modifier on that for grown hemp, they would only have a 5% chance. It's effectively halving it. Only roll ingredient chances on the final hit for a node. By default that's false. Basically what that means is when you cut a tree down, rather than getting an ingredient chance roll each time you swing the axe on the tree, it'll only roll one chance when the tree actually gets mined out. Same for mining nodes and that sort of thing. We've got all our drop sources here, as well as the values or the chances of obtaining an ingredient from said sources. Pretty self-explanatory. We'll just mention that 1.0 is a 100% drop rate, whereas 0.1 is a 10%. Ingredient bag settings, the command to open up the bag, which is this one here, Bag item settings, make sure these are the same as the recipe. So basically this is what we're seeing in the game here. When we open up the recipe menu and check the bag, you need to make sure this kind of matches what's in their actual recipe. Whitelist of items that can be placed in the ingredient bag in addition to ingredients. So this basically prevents certain items. So it allows you to add certain items into the iBag that otherwise aren't part of the cooking recipe, cooking plugin, such as seeds and that sort of thing. Place gathered ingredients directly into the iBag is true. Maximum iBag slots is 30 by default. Should ingredients bags drop on death is set to false by default. These are all the sound settings, mainly for the cooking menu interface. And you can just set them to 0 or null them out to disable them. So you can set it to null if you don't want to have certain sound effects in there. Market settings, so the currency type that you use in the market, so you can have it to scrap, economics, or server rewards. The command to open the market is /market by default. Allow sell and allow buy. So if you don't want players to be able to buy, also sell ingredients, only buy them, you can set that to true or false respectively. And settings for market NPCs, so you can see here we've got the items that the NPCs are wearing. So the burlap shirt, the trousers, and the boonie hat by default with certain skins. An item that the NPC will be holding, so by default is a pitchfork, as you can see with old mate here. Moving out of general settings, we'll go into meal settings now. Now, meal settings are basically just a list of different types of meals, as well as a few other bits and pieces. So, maximum meals meals that a player can have active at once. This is the basically meal buffs. So, if you want to allow that to be 6 active buffs at a time, you can set that to 6. If you don't want, if you just want to allow 1, you can set it to 1. Only allow players to cook recipes that they have learned. Now, this is a new system that I've introduced called a recipe card system. The recipe card system is basically a searchable recipe menu. So by default, players start with no recipes, and they will need to find them from crates or barrels. And as they do, they can learn them, and they'll appear on their recipe list. And that's what that pertains to. So you can set that to true, and you can see here all the drop chances here for it. This is under cookbook settings for that specifically. So allow players to find duplicate recipes if they already have. So setting that to true will basically mean that players can receive recipe cards that they already have, and that kind of forces players to trade them between each other. Drop chances, and these are the chances for obtaining these recipe cards from different drop sources. Meals, we've got just basically a list of different types of meals. You can see here kind of respond to the recipe menu, but I'll take a breakdown of what basically makes up a meal. So if there's a meal in here, specifically default meals that you don't want enabled, just simply set them to false and they won't appear on the meal. By default, the plugin will automatically reacquire any meals in here that are in the default list and set them to true. So don't delete them, just set them to false if you don't want them. These are the skin IDs that correspond with the workshop for the ingredients and the meals. So the icons and the pictures and everything else. This is the flavorful description by default, but you would probably want to adjust that in the language file. The duration is how long the buff is active for, and a list of buffs, as well as the modifier that corresponds to that buff. So for example, if I want to have another buff on here, I can add, say, harvest, and we can give that we'll say a 1.0, which would be a 100% increase yield for the harvest buff. So that would actually show up with 2 different buffs instead of 1. Commands to run when the player consumes the food. Now this is broken up into a dictionary as a command key and a value for description. Now basically this one here allows you to add your own custom buffs or custom content to the meals, and I'll give you an example of how to do it. So since this is a dictionary, we're going to open it up with a couple of curly braces. And what we're going to do here is, because it requires 2 strings, we're going to add the command that we're going to run. So we're going to do o.grant user ID cooking not instant. Now it also requires a description. So we're going to say this buff will allow you to cook meals instantly. And that's all there is to it. So we're adding a command to run when this is consumed. Now we need to add one to run when this expires, and we do this specifically because we don't want players having this permanently. Now because this is just simply a list, there's no descriptions required for the expiry buffs. We're just simply going to open up a couple of square brackets because this is a list, and we're just going to add our values in here. So we're going to o.revoke user ID cooking.instant. And I better fix up my my permissions. And that's pretty much all there is to it. This is what it looks like in game. You can see here we've got the command. This buff allows you to cook meals instantly. And yeah, when consuming that will give me the buff temporarily through an oxide and then remove it. So yeah, pretty powerful and yeah, simple. You can also run, once-off commands as well. So if you wanted to, I don't know, give ID rifle.ak or whatever you want. You can do that as well. So you can just do them as once-off commands. You don't actually have to have an end command if you don't need it. Persist through death. This basically it's only relevant to ones that use that have timers. So it just means if the player dies, they'll keep the buff even after they die. Whereas by default, the buffs are removed on death. Cook time is how long it takes for them to cook. Self-explanatory. Use cooldown is basically if you don't want the thing to be spammed. If it's a super powerful buff and you want to have it on cooldown, you can add the amount of seconds in terms of cooldown between meals, between consumptions. So if this has a cooldown value, they won't be able to consume this, more than once every 10 minutes. Permissions to cook. Now this is it's just a simple string. So if you don't want, if you want to be able to add a permission or require a permission to be able to make this meal specifically, you can add a permission. So cooking.vip or whatever you want in order to do that. The next one we have here is drop weight. So if we're cooking this meal or if we're receiving this meal from another source, this is just simply the drop weight associated with it. So when we roll it for value, it adds the drop. You need to look up drop weight systems. I don't really want to go into a detailed explanation of it right now. Then we have the ingredients for the meal. So this is just simply a text-based ingredient requirement. So chocolate bar, sugar, milk, and egg. Now you need to be very careful with putting the right names in with all lowercase. I would not use any uppercase, and I wouldn't create any meals with uppercase values. Otherwise things could bugger up. And this is simply how many are required, the type of ingredient, and how many are required. By default, the UI kind of fits in 10 or 11. After that, it's going to start going in behind the quantity button, so be wary of that. Mozzarella, every other one is pretty much the same, so I'm just going to skip over the meals side of things. We'll go straight into menu settings next. So menu settings, the icon that appears if the meal is favorited and unfavorited, which is just those star icons. Cooking queue. Now this is realistically this particular menu is just simply heaps of different hex codes. So what do they call them? Unity RGB codes to change all of the colors for all of the menus. So you can completely recolor this bitch if you want to, in both the background colors and the foreground colors, everything. It's very, 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 very configurable if you put the time in for it. There's also some anchor settings as well. For the craft queue, the buff icon, these are all the default anchor settings. And yeah, then we've got the HUD button settings, whitelist of ovens, as well as blacklist. So we don't want furnaces and large furnaces and electric furnaces to open up the cooking menu, or maybe we do. That's pretty aesthetically pleasing if we do that. but you can blacklist certain items. Otherwise, you can also whitelist certain items. So if you only want the thing to open up with a, I don't know, a campfire, you can set it so it only opens up with a campfire, and no other entity will open up the ingredient menu. And that's just simply the button here that appears. Next up is ingredient settings. The menu is pretty straightforward. Ingredient settings, which is our final menu, is just simply all the settings pertaining to ingredients. So allow default effects of an item that the ingredient inherits to apply with eaten. This basically means that if you eat an apple, you're going to get the metabolism benefits of eating an apple, such as the calories, the hydration, and the healing over time effect. You can set that to false if you don't want that to happen for ingredients. Flour, so you've got the different types of ingredients here, flour, spices, sugar. It's really just all the default ingredients, so the basic ingredients at the top, then you've got the default ingredients down the bottom here. That gets added automatically based on what default ingredients you add into when creating a meal, which I'll cover shortly. So let's just go through the ingredients class. So I've got again enabled, set that to false if you don't want the ingredient to be used. This is the short name that the ingredient is based off of, so by default it's apple. So you get the sound of moving an apple around in your inventory and all that other fun stuff. The skin ID is probably the most important one, so that's what icon you see when you consume the meal. So when you see the meal, both in its icon format and in its UI format. The gathering sources. Now the gathering sources are, again, there's 30 something of them. You can have as many or as little of them as you like. If there's no gathering sources specified, then you're not going to be able to obtain it. You'll notice that the custom ingredients all have different gathering sources, whereas the default ingredients just simply have default as their ingredient. So yeah, if you're adding default ingredients, do that as you please. Whereas if you want chocolate bars falling from trees, you do you. Minimum drops, maximum drops. This is just simply the minimum and maximum amount of items you'll receive per successful roll of the dice. The drop weight is how likely you are to receive that from those drop sources. So you can make it so flour is going to be, you set the flour to say 500, so it's going to be 5 times more likely to get it from potato and corn than, say another one that is also from potato and corn. Market info is the available market stock, maximum stock the shop can stock, 0 disables it, price the market buys and sells for. So again, it's pretty self-explanatory. So all the ingredients are pretty much self-explanatory. You can, you can kind of figure it out pretty easily. Now, if you want to create your own custom ingredient, before I get into this, I'm just going to pause this real quick and grab a couple of IDs. Alright, so I'm going to create a new meal called chili stuffed peppers. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to find the last curly brace that's corresponding to this list, add a comma, copy and paste the new one across. I'm going to call it something, so we'll just say chili stuffed peppers. Sorry, we're doing ingredients right now. So I'm going to add maybe a bell pepper. Now, what I can do here is I can add, I obviously want that to be enabled, the short prefab name. I'm just going to set it to apple to correspond with the other custom ingredients. Now for the skin, I need to basically add the skin ID of a bell pepper. Okay, so that's going to be for a bell pepper. And I want this to drop from, let's say corn. So I'm going to add this as a drop from corn. Now I want this to be a really high drop from corn, so I'm going to set it to 500. And we'll just say from 2 to 5 of them are going to drop each time. And that's nice and simple. So we've got bell pepper added. Now I want to add, obviously I want to add an actual meal called chili stuffed peppers. So to do that, we're going to go up into the meal settings. And we'll minimize this before we do. Scroll all the way down, bottom here, grab the last curly brace and copy and paste. And I'm going to rename this one here to chili stuffed peppers. I'm going to base off fish.cooked. we're going to add the new skin ID that I've created for it, which is a 512 by 512. Is this a pizza or a pastry? Now we're going to change the description to we call this capsicum in Australia. I don't know if I spelled right, but that's fine. Duration is 60. We're going to give it we'll give it the Bradley radar, and then we're also going to give it the harvest buff too. And we'll give that a 2.0 because it's going to really kick us into gear. We don't want to run any commands, or we don't want to persist through death. Everything else we're going to leave pretty default, except for the ingredients. So the ingredients we're going to make, we're going to add spices. We'll make it so it requires 2 spices. We're going to add the bell peppers. Now we need to be very careful that we make sure our names are identical. So I've got bell pepper here, and then we've got bell pepper up here. So we're going to make that require 3 bell peppers. I'm going to require cheese, just 1 cheese, and yeah, that'll be it. Still 3 ingredient meal. So we're going to save this and load it up in game, see what it looks like. Alright, so we're in game, and we are going to open up recipe menu, go to recipes, and scroll to the end here. You can see here we now have chili stuffed peppers. We can click on here and we can see that the ingredient bell pepper is harvested sources from harvesting corn. We also require spices and cheese to be crafted. Now I've got the instant and free crafting permissions on, so I'm just going to craft this. You can see it's here. I'm going to eat it. You can see that we've got anti-Bradley radar and harvest. So yeah, that's pretty much it. I hope you guys enjoyed this showcase and tutorial. If you have any questions, again, reach out to me in Discord or on the respective sales pages. And yeah, hope you guys enjoy.